Hi, Sean. How are you today?
Great. How are you, Tiff?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm looking forward to really diving into our learning in public today, especially around inline editing. I think particularly because when I first started at Stackbit, really understanding how these two data attributes worked was something that I really got a lot of value out of our conversation around. So I'm excited to dive into it again today for others.
For sure. I think that this particular feature is the thing that really sets Stackbit apart. I like to call inline editing or visual editing being it's taking the editing experience to the next level. And so it definitely takes a minute to really wrap your head around how it works. And there's responsibility put and work put on the shoulders of developers to be able to implement this, but we often highly encourage it because it really passes on so much power to those content editors.
Exactly, exactly. And I think a good place to start before we dive into this inline editing and the power of it specifically, maybe I'll share my project that we've been working on and just kind of as a quick refresher of where we're at and then the purpose of inline editing. So if I go here, I have my Stackbit project running locally. And you can see when I go into page that we can edit um, the text here. So right now we have Acme Corp, greatest top talent agency in the world. And as expected, that will be reflected right away, not only in Stackbit, but of course in Contentful as well. And then the purpose with inline editing is we are now enabling content editors to be able to come into the visual editor and edit directly on the glass. I guess that's, I don't know if is that a Stackbit term or is that something that is known on the glass?
I think it's a Stackbit term. It kind of comes and goes occasionally, but yeah, I usually either say inline or in context or in real time or something like that. That it, to me is a little bit more tangible. But yeah, basically, like you just click in the preview window and make the change.
Exactly. I like in real time. That's a good one. Yeah. So, and I think that's a great way. The power, it's so powerful too, because one of the things that if you're coming in to make changes to your content, it's great to do it from page here and you can see it happening, but to be able to do it directly in real time, see what it will look like is so powerful to really help you work faster as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, so let's dive into it. Let's start with going through the docs here. I'm going to scroll down a little bit to how inline editing works. And so there's really two main data attributes that we utilize for inline editing, one being data SB object ID. Let me zoom in a bit here. And the other being data SB field path. And for me, the data SB object ID was one that it took me a bit longer to wrap my head around. The field path, it was like, okay, this makes sense where, targeting a specific field path that the content editor can come in and edit. But the object ID one took me a little bit to wrap my head around, and I'm not sure why. But maybe Sean, let's start with the object ID, and I might get you to kind of walk us through that one because I feel like you really explain it well. I'm putting you on the spot here.
That's all good. I think that we could step back for a second and describe what we're actually doing by annotating these components, because if we've made it this far, then you understand that Stackbit requires you to have your content separated from your code and to have that content structured and defined and backed by some schema that Stackbit can understand. So inherently, if you've made it to this point, Stackbit understands the structure of your content. And then what happens is if you use the page editor tool that you were just using, Tiff, that you make a change and there's a mechanism that can either be controlled by Stackbit or that you can handle on your own as a developer that's basically listening for content changes and then updating your development server. And so then the preview window basically just reloads in real time. And so there's honestly not a lot of magic in that process. It's Stackbit handling the editing and your site, or Stackbit helping your site to listen for changes to that content and then changing the content on the screen. What Stackbit doesn't actually understand by default is how you are mapping that structured content to the components and the pages that make up your site. Because all we're really doing is we are rendering this preview on your behalf, but your code is your code, and that's separate from your content. So we understand your content, we don't really understand your code. And so what we're doing by annotating these pages and components is you're telling Stackbit exactly how you map the structure of your content to the elements that are on the screen. And then Stackbit can use those data attributes to basically build up this tree and this understanding of how that content maps together. And we can say, okay, cool. Now we can put a little highlight around the heading, which we'll show in a little bit, and give you this experience of changing it. And when you save it, we know exactly where that content is supposed to be stored in the content source. So that's kind of the background to why we're doing this and how the visual editing is going to work. In terms of your question specifically with the object ID and the field path, the object ID is contextualizing the fields that are being edited. And Contentful is honestly a little bit of a unique case, and so is file-based content. And those are the two sources that we work with the most frequently. But because we're talking about Contentful here, I'll just speak in terms of Contentful. And I guess there's a parallel to probably the typical API or headless CMS in that every piece of content or data that comes from the content source is going to be stored probably in some record or object. Contentful calls them entries. And every one of those things, which Contentful calls entries, is going to have a unique ID associated with it. This is just like a record in a database. So, right, you're looking at this table here. This is an object or an entry in Contentful. And I think on the right side, maybe you have to info. Yeah, there's an entry ID. So this is a unique ID that is attributed to this particular entry. And so that basically, the way I think about this is that that's basically what you're going to resolve the object ID to, and we'll see that in action in a minute. But what that tells Stackbit is basically contextualizing then the fields that you edit inside that. And I'll go into a little bit more detail as we actually type, because if I go too far now, I think it'll be too theoretical, but that's probably a good place to stop before we start writing some code.
Perfect. Thanks, Sean. That was great. So I'm going to go into the code now, and I'll go into the content file here because I know.
And the role of this particular file for folks who are watching is specifically just about retrieving content from Contentful, transforming it slightly, and then transforming it slightly so that it's in a shape that the pages and components of the site can use. So you can see like where Tiff has stopped now, this map entry function, it's basically taking an entry from Contentful and then it's adding some attributes to it. So it's adding, or it's passing through. Oh no, it's determining the ID and the type, which it needs a little logic to figure that out. And then it gives a different shape if it's an asset versus if it's an actual object. And then you can see it's kind of running this function recursively, so that what we're left with after running this function is this object, this like big object tree of data that we can pass down to components as they continue to nest in the code.
Exactly. And then let me flip back here too. So for this one, the property, as it says here, the property already transformed to ID. So we're referring to this ID here, which is coming from the entry being passed in, right, Sean?
Exactly. So this is we're already resolving what this ID value is. And so what this is showing is that the ID property on any particular entry that we're using in this project is going to resolve to Contentful's entry ID, that unique ID. And so we're going to be able to just use that directly in the object type data attribute.
Perfect. And then, so kind of going back to the one when you were speaking about it, I pulled up this entry here, the Acme Corp, which is the heading. And then I know we saw here that the entry ID. So maybe could we test it out by, I know we could just pass in props, but maybe just to test it out is a good place to start by actually utilizing this specific ID, or what do you find is the best way to kind of show that? I guess we can go back to the docs, of course.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to look at the docs are going to touch this hero component. So maybe the way you start here is jump into that hero component in the code, and rather than putting it in the markup just before you get to that return statement. So between line 10 and 11 there, just do a console log and do props.id.
Props.id, perfect. And let's go.
And then if you go, open your console. And there we go. We've got
so
two. Are there two on this particular, two heroes on this page?
maybe
yes. Okay. Okay.
that was my next question for you. Okay, perfect. Okay, so that makes sense as to why two are coming in.
And it's running twice because of this is a React and Next thing. If you run into this situation, and it can be really frustrating to debug. So we don't have to get into it, but it's basically like you could use a use effect hook if you only wanted to, if there's some process that you want to run twice. But if you're just logging like this, it doesn't matter, and you're going to run into this problem anyways if you if there's a need for you to get around it.
Yeah.
But just point being, you can ignore the double, each one being logged twice in a row.
All right, perfect. So if we go back here, I'll take this out, but now we can see that it's coming in. So we can simply on here then on the parent div, data SB object. I don't have it fully memorized. Object
ID. Yep. Object dash ID. Yep.
And then we'll pass in props.id there. And then we go
now, I wonder if, does it, I haven't tested this in a while. Will it actually highlight anything now?
I don't
if
think
you go
so.
to the hero.
Let's try. Oh yeah, it does.
Yeah. So, okay. So this is basically now you we can just piecemeal this together, because now you can see that just because you put that object ID in there, now Stackbit knows how to map that back to the content source. And so it knows exactly where this element is on the screen. And if you were to hit if you hit edit in Contentful, you'll probably jump right back to that same entry. I think. Yes. Great. And if you go back to Stackbit and you were to click the pencil icon, you will jump. Close that. And then click. Yep. From there, it'll open the hero component fields directly, rather than having to kind of drill down through the page.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is, I mean, with this very quick, not even one line really, well, technically, I guess one line, it really unlocks a lot of power for content editors, like right out of the gate.
Exactly. Yep.
So then if we wanted to go back to the docs for a sec here, so you can see here we covered adding ID property to page, and then using this to set the object ID here. Now let's scroll down a bit. You can see the example that we just covered, which was passing in the ID. All right, let's get into the field path portion of this, which is right now. So right now in this example, the field path is passing in heading, which heading is coming from, because it's targeting this heading specifically here. So if we go into Contentful, I feel like seeing it in Contentful where the ID is coming from always helps me as a good starting point. I don't know if that's strange or not, but I feel like I can visually see where it's coming from, and then kind of work my way backwards.
Yeah, makes sense. So you're identifying the ID. The ID is in the URL when you're editing that content in Contentful, and then you have the fields on the page, and that's what you're going to pass to these various field path attributes.
So heading, so for this, Sean, heading, where is it here? Heading here, which we're passing in, is coming from because we're referencing heading here, or where specifically is that coming from, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's easy to get lost there. So what you just highlighted is actually the label for that field,
Mhm.
and there's the label and the I don't know if Contentful calls it an ID or some folks will call it a slug. That
Mm.
those can differ wildly from another. So just because it says heading doesn't mean that heading in lowercase is the value that you should use. So
Yeah.
if you go to the top tabs there in Contentful and click Content Model,
Ah,
we're going to take
yes.
a look at this content model and then go to hero
Hero.
and heading. And you actually, I think, have to hit settings on heading. And then yeah, they do call it an ID. So field ID, that's what we are, that's the value that we want here.
Perfect. Thank you. I knew there was something I was missing. Perfect.
In fact, I think, can you click, you see the JSON preview tab up a little bit? Yeah. Okay. There's a quick, that's
Hmm.
maybe a little bit easier if you don't want to click into everything. You can see all the IDs kind of listed in this JSON response here.
Display field. Is that what the ID is? It's referencing?
The display field it's yeah, the ID. So your field's there. So you can see the ID for that one. And then you can see the ID for body below it. So rather than clicking into each one, that was the point I was making. The display field is just that's a UI property that
Hmm.
Contentful is using to decide which field to use when you're looking at a list of items or entries in Contentful.
Got it. Perfect. All right. So yes, ID here, fields ID. So then in this case, we're focusing on the heading. So it'd be heading. I'm
Exactly.
going to
Yep.
copy this actually versus typing it out. Less chance. And then so we can see here our heading. And if we paste this in here, back to the project, you can see here, we can now highlight the specific heading. And if I go into edit in Contentful, it will take us again to the heading.
Yep. Exactly.
Perfect.
And so now you should be able to edit inline as well. So if you make the change without opening that page panel, um, you should we'll see it load for a second, and then you should see it pop up in Contentful immediately, and it
Mhm.
will be
The
there. It
best.
is. Yep.
Perfect. That's so great. And I mean, this is a very quick example we did, but as you continue to make it as customizable as you want for your editors, this can become very customizable, but it's kind of up to you as the developer or as you are working with designers or the business team as to how flexible you want to make it.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
All right, Sean, I think did we finish the docs now? Let's see here.
Yeah, we've got an advanced annotations section. So this is talking about there's a button. That one's not really, that's not altogether that different, I don't believe.
Passing in.
Yeah, one thing I will mention that can help and hopefully doesn't confuse you too much is that you can technically omit the object ID, the data SB object ID attribute,
Mhm.
but you can't omit the object ID itself. So, for example, so if you actually, yeah, on this page, get rid
Mhm.
of the data SB object ID.
Okay.
And then if you do that, save, go back, we probably won't be able to edit anything. Yeah, we can't edit anything. Okay, now go back to the code and data SB field path. This is, all right, I'm going to try to use words to describe this. So, well, get rid of that again. Yep. And then in field path, you use the curly brackets around your quotes, and then change your quotes to those backticks so we can do some string interpolation here. Yep. Okay. And now you're going to do, we're interpolating here. So you can do the $ and then more curly brackets. And then this is going to be props.id. inside,
Pressing in them.
and then
Okay.
outside. Yep, and then outside the yes, great. You're reading my mind. A colon,
Colon,
and then yep, you had it, and then heading.
heading.
Perfect. Now save that, and let's see if we can then edit that heading. And we can edit. Okay, so this is interesting because we can, and it kind of shows you a little bit more of the flexibility because there's all kinds of wild stuff that you can do with the field paths, but that we have a specific syntax more or less for annotations. And what we just did is you can use object ID colon field path, and you
Mhm.
can apply all of that to the data SB field path attribute. And then so it's like if you had, for example, with that button, if you don't have the HTML structure
Mhm.
to be able to break up those two,
Mm,
or if, like if you didn't have a span there on line
yeah.
10, that
Yeah.
maybe you would want to do that in line. There might be other situations, I don't know, but you notice that that what you lost in taking that approach is that now Stackbit doesn't know about the wrapper
Yes,
around the
exactly.
hero anymore. So that's what you were getting by bringing the object ID as well. So there, yeah, I think that's just we could we could spend more time with this, but I think that this kind of it's a good introduction to brush the surface, and that if you have more complex needs, they're they're probably going to be solved, or be at least be solvable. It's just a little bit of a matter of learning really the syntax and the style of building these annotations, which for the most part it goes object ID colon field path, or they're two separate object ID field path, and then field path is generally an X path. Um, if you're familiar with that, it's like a common way to look up uh, elements in the DOM within some nested structure, and so we generally try to follow that XPath syntax as much as we can.
That's great. And I think too, this is such a good example because it really shows how flexible Stackbit is. There's many ways. We're not defining just one way to do something. It's really what works best for you and your team.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This is great. Thank you, Sean, so much. I always enjoy these conversations with you because I always leave feeling like I've learned something new or a different tip or trick. And you always break things down in such a great and easy to understand way. So thank you so much.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I've had to talk about it a lot of times before getting to this particular point. So I feel like, yeah, we're getting there, and it's good practice. But as always, looking for feedback, and of course, more questions. The more questions you have, the easier it becomes for us to explain it. But also, you might uncover an opportunity for us to actually improve the developer experience also.
Exactly. And speaking of questions, before we quickly wrap up here, I'll link down below as well, not only the docs for this and the project for this that we're using as the sample project, but also to our Discord channel. So any of those questions, make sure to join and come ask there, or just have a conversation with us. I think we both love to talk about this. So we're always down to have a good conversation around it.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thanks, Sean. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, thanks, Tiff.